Good evening. Welcome to Illinois Law, brought to you by the Illinois State Bar Association. My name is Nancy Hablitzel, and I'm your moderator this evening. We have an interesting panel with us, and we're going to be discussing mental health issues in juvenile court. My first panelist on the end is Joe Monahan. Joe's a partner and co-founder of Monahan & Cohen, a Chicago law firm. Prior to entering law school, Joe obtained his master's degree in social work and served as executive director of a child welfare agency. He served as an adjunct professor of law at Loyola Law School for the past 15 years and teaches the mental health law course there. Joe has been an active member of the Illinois State Bar Association for the past 26 years and has been chair of the Committee on Mental Health Law, which is the committee that is bringing you this program this evening. And my second panelist is Phil Milsk. Phil is an attorney in private practice, and he concentrates in governmental affairs and educational advocacy. His areas of focus include disabilities, school law, health law, social services, and mental health issues. He's a member of the ISBA Disability Law Committee and the Education Law Section Council. And my third panelist is Dr. Bernard Gloss. He's a licensed psychologist who has worked in academic and corporate, not-for-profit, and criminal justice areas. He has pioneered programs for juveniles in court systems and has worked with schools and other issues of mental health as a consultant. So welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
And I'm happy to have you here. We're going to be talking about something that those of us who work in the juvenile court areas may be very familiar with, but for some people who are not quite as familiar, I'd like to have you talk a little bit about what are the mental health issues that come up in juvenile court and where do they first arise? Joe, do you want to start?
You know, it's interesting, Nancy, that we sit here in Chicago, and in 1899, actually, the juvenile court was started in Illinois, in Cook County, by virtue of Jane Addams and other social reformers. And I think those people back then recognized that there are different issues that impact juveniles particularly. And as we've seen the development of the juvenile court, we also look to, now we're really looking at children who have serious mental health issues. Oftentimes it starts directly when the children are very young. They are from parents who might have mental health diagnoses. They may have substance abuse problems or drug abuse problems of some kind. And I think we see that oftentimes for people who end up in the juvenile court system. Yeah?
And the numbers aren't trivial. I think some recent research that was done across several states and different kinds of levels of intervention for juveniles has found that just even kids coming into the system, somewhere between 45 and 50% of them present with mental health issues. Those that end up in detention, that number increases to 60%, and those that find themselves in some state correctional juvenile system, the numbers are quite close to 70%. So that means there's a lot of kids that are out there who bring serious issues with them besides their criminal behavior.
You know, and I think it's important too to think about the juvenile court not just as criminals, but also as children who have been abused, who have been neglected, who are dependent upon the state. And that's a huge population of young people who end up in our court system, and the court has to deal with them, whether, as you suggest, Doctor, that they are criminals, or whether they're really victims of abuse and neglect and or maybe dependent on the state.
And I think part of the issue is that there's a tendency to look at them as simply, young criminals and not understand that there's a whole picture behind that, and that they just didn't wake up one morning and say, I want to harm someone or harm something. Mm-hmm. But it's a whole life experience of abuse and other issues that come into play that really then impacts what their behavior is and oftentimes gets them into trouble.
I think some people will argue that using and focusing on mental health as really just an excuse to give kids. You notice that in your practice? That
I think, it maybe is an excuse, but I think that the real issue is unless we get into underlying issues that are the cause of things, we can't fix them. That if we don't address the issues that are at the foundation of why a person chooses to act or think in a certain way, then those issues will never get resolved. And so it's not actually an excuse, it's trying to get to some of the basic core issues that are driving the individual.
I think, though, that some people say that kids who have a mental health problem still have to be punished, right?
I don't think punishment works for any kind of kid. I think the fact is we have to help them deal with the issues that they bring. We need to start reinforcing their positive qualities. We need to empower them to see themselves as having the capacity to do other things.
Yeah. As a parent or a guardian of one of these children, I would favor a restorative approach, a
Yes.
rehabilitative approach, as doctor says. And if I was a parent coming into juvenile court accompanying my child, I would want to know that my child had an appropriate assessment of their condition, and as part of any kind of adjudicative order, some services that would be provided to address those issues. And as we see more and more, there are fewer and fewer services available, particularly in the community, for children and other people with mental illness. But as you say, I think that addressing these needs in the short term and the long term has a positive impact on society and in the community.
And I think we have a lot of research to show that if we can take the family unit, if we take the community and make those interventions there, the likelihood of success is much better than trying to separate out all these pieces, because normally if a kid is struggling, there are probably parents and siblings who are struggling. And that if we can somehow reach all of them in some kind of intervention that focuses on how do we help them all work together better, to achieve those things that all of them want.
I'm listening to you and I'm thinking of the old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Where do you start to prevent? I mean, what, for instance, can you do with a very young child? Is there something in the system, in the school system, anywhere that the parents can access?
There's services available to children from 0 to 3, which are called early intervention services. You would have to have a diagnosis or at least suspect that the child has significant developmental delays. It's awfully, and you would know better than I would, a young age to diagnose mental health issues or severe emotional disturbance in a child 0 to 3, but even 3 to 5, because special education eligibility under federal and state law begins at age 3. So even as young as 3, school systems have to provide services. They don't necessarily have to come from school personnel, but they have to arrange for services. And even that might be too young for the diagnosis to, perhaps not, but I think the parents need to know what their rights are, and they should consult either an attorney or an advocate in their community. Even a Center for Independent Living would be a good resource to find out what their legal rights are with respect to special education, because that can trigger the diagnostic work and then the delivery of services.
And in fact, we'll be doing a program later on the school issues, but we'll focus on the court right now. What about the children in the abuse and neglect system? Children in some places in Chicago, in Cook County, that's separated out, but in other parts of the state, the abuse neglect courts and the juvenile court would be heard in the same place. So it just depends on where you're living.
There has been a sea change in the juvenile court in the last 20 years. And at one point in the 70s and the 80s, there were about 55,000 children in state care who were outside of their own homes. That's a lot of children for the state to be dealing with. Today, I think the data suggests that there's about 17,000. So we've gone from 55,000 children out of their home in the abuse and neglect area to about 17,000. one would hope that that would mean that the state could provide better services, more permanency for children to be in their homes, and really address the difficult issues of mental health that come about there. In Cook County, as you mentioned, there is a special juvenile court, and it is separated. Delinquency cases are held separate and apart from the abuse and neglect hearings. Other places throughout the state that might be heard by the same judge. And I think a lot of it has to do with how the people, the actors in the juvenile court are trained and how they're going to look at the issues of juvenile court. Do we want to punish children? Do we want to provide services, as you suggest? Do we want to have communication and integration between the schools and social services to try to help and address the mental health issues, which are so important in the juvenile court?
Even in terms of foster care, there's been several models developed that involve training parents and having a mental health person work with them, because most of these kids, wherever there's been significant caregiver disruption, are going to present with a lot of problems. And
we're going to come right back there as soon as we finish our break.
Okay.
We're going to go just take a brief break, and we'll be back right with you talking again about the mental health issues in juvenile court. This is fascinating, and I thank you to all three of my panelists. We'll be back in a few minutes.
Bye, Tyler.
Dear, it's time for serious talk
Oh?
about my daycare. When I started out, it was just to help the neighbors. But lately, it's getting to be a real handful. I need some help.
What can I do?
I need advice on more space, a loan,
What about incorporating?
and insurance.
Wait, I know who we can call.
Times like this require sound advice. Your lawyer can help. A message from the Illinois State Bar Association.
It's your fault! Never! Never!
Over and over,
It's our problem! Leave me alone! Shut up! Out!
time and again,
No! Drive me nuts! Shut up! You're the dumbest
generation after generation.
I hate you! I hate you too!
Isn't it time we stop the cycle? Now.
I hate you! I hate you!
Stop adult violence. Teach kids peace. A message from the Illinois State Bar Association.
Welcome back to Illinois Law, brought to you by the Illinois State Bar Association. I'm Nancy Hablitzel, your moderator, and I'm here with my three panelists, Joe Monahan, Phil Milsk, and Dr. Bernard Gloss. And we were all talking about the mental health issues that go on in juvenile court, and in many ways are some of the issues that actually bring the children to juvenile court. Dr. Gloss, you were just going to talk about the models in the foster care system.
Yeah, there are models that have been developed that work with foster families to address whatever mental health needs that the child has come, so that that foster care doesn't have to be just a protection for the child, but it actually can work within that family context to start addressing some of the issues that have developed because of what may have gone on in the child's life, so that even that period of foster care can be very productive in trying to respond to the specific issues that that child brings.
Do they work also with the birth families in some cases?
Yes.
In terms of
In
treating
fact, what can be
the
done
constellation?
with the criminal justice system has found that sometimes if you have such family disruption in this organization, to pull the kid out temporarily into a different family setting where that group can work on the child, and then some work done with the family of origin, and gradually work to reunify so that the family of origin has learned some skills and some things to be helpful, so that they can interact in the way that's helpful with this child when he eventually comes back home. So there are a lot of possibilities with these type of models, but the key thing is to recognize the fact that there are mental health issues, and we have to find ways of addressing them in the best way we can.
You know, I'm, I'm familiar with, in California, they have actual mental health juvenile courts where the idea is not simply to punish children, but really to provide treatment, hold them accountable for what they have done, but also provide the treatment to, and as you mentioned earlier, Nancy, the whole notion of prevention, divert these kids from the criminal justice system, because I think there isn't it right, Doctor, the more context that a child has with the criminal justice system, the greater the possibility of them spending more time incarcerated.
Yes.
And it seems to me it should be a real effort to try to address mental health issues, get the services that children need, and I think then the question is, how do you do that? You mentioned assessment,
Right.
you know, working with the school, and I'm sure, Doctor, you've had some experiences with children who have not been assessed properly.
Right, and I think especially in the court system, when we're looking at numbers of more than half, 1 out of every 2 kids possibly coming into the justice system with some issues, to pretend they don't exist and that somehow we can create a change in this child's life so that they can become successful and so forth, I think doesn't make a lot of sense. And we have to find ways of doing some initial screenings, and then, you know, it's not a one-size-all thing, but where we basically, you know, keep moving till we get the answers that we need so that the court has an idea of what are the dynamics going on here, because we end up with other issues. If I've done some evaluations where an intervention was designed for a child before there was any evaluation, and there was no way this intervention could work, and in fact it didn't. You know, and then the question is, if you don't do the assessment and you do an intervention and it doesn't work, then there's a tendency to say, well, the child must have not cooperated or something, but the fact is that the dynamics of this child's disorder would prevent him or her for being successful in that setting. In fact, we got the court to find another intervention and the child blossomed. But this is why really assessing what's going on and understanding what's happening with that child is important, because otherwise our attempts to fix it will fail.
I think anyone who's ever parented would tell you what works for this child doesn't
Yes.
work for this child,
Correct.
even if they have no mental health issues.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And it just,
Yeah.
you have to tailor.
And what concerns me a lot is are the lack of resources. I mean, in some counties, they probably can't even afford to hire anyone to do an appropriate assessment, and the families may not be able to afford that either. And that's of great concern, because as you say, without an appropriate assessment, you're really at a loss. It's just kind of a hit and miss approach.
Right.
And you may miss more than you hit, which doesn't help the child or the family or the community.
What resources are there? I mean, if you are a parent and you have a child with a mental health issue, whether it's you're being involved in the abuse neglect system or the juvenile court system, how do you know what to ask for your child?
I think one thing is that you ask and talk to the attorney that's appointed to represent. That's a first start. Every child who's been accused of a crime certainly is going to have an attorney with some level of skill that will be able to offer some resources. Community mental health centers will be able to sometimes to help evaluate. The Alliance for Mentally Ill has chapters all over the state that can be a great resource. Talking to other parents who have children that have got themselves into some type of contact with the juvenile court could also be. You know, you really have to work hard and advocate for your child in order to get the mental health services, particularly when you don't have the resources to do that. They're equipped for equality. The Department of Mental Health will have resources as well.
And what about the schools? Do they
The schools
play a role?
can play a role, but the court has to be made aware, if they're not already aware, of the resources that the school can provide. And some judges are not aware of what the educational rights are of the child, or of the personnel that the school may make available. We also have community mental health centers in many places in the state. Funding is dwindling. It's an issue, has been an issue for a number of years now, with the state's finances being the way it is. But there are community mental health centers. Some may have waiting lists. But I think some of the resources Joe mentioned can steer you in the right direction. But I do think that that trying to divert this child from the corrective aspects of the punitive aspects of the court system is the way to go in most cases, and the parent should always be looking, or the guardian should be looking at alternatives and trying to get the best. It's just like if you had an illness, you would want the best treatment for your child. If the child had an illness, it's the same thing here. You'd want the best treatment you can possibly find.
And if the child is involved in the DCFS system, then DCFS has resources.
Yeah,
to
the Department
offer.
of Children and Family Services may become involved, and they certainly will have resources that would be available to try to keep kids and to try to help kids have their mental health needs addressed. You know, when you're talking about the school system, Phil, what you're really saying is that schools have an obligation to identify children who have special needs. And that identification means that sometimes that will include psychological testing and other testing that will be available that might help identify maybe this just isn't delinquent behavior. Is that right?
Right. Unfortunately, and Joe's correct, that they do have an obligation, but also if there's certain inappropriate conduct that takes place on school property or during school hours, the law allows the school to call the law enforcement officials in. So they can call the police if you allegedly commit a crime and shirk their responsibilities in some ways to the child in terms of the educational services. And I think that's unfortunate. I mean, I know that a lot of school officials believe they should have that authority, and they do under law. They were able to get that put into the federal law. But the reality is we want to have a holistic approach to trying to serve that child and at the same time protect other children and other members of the community and the school community. And I think that's best done by addressing the needs of this child appropriately.
If a child is involved in a situation like that at school and the police are called and the parents suspect that the child may not have been able to control his actions, should they at that point also ask the school to evaluate the child?
Sure.
One of the things too, you know, to piggyback on this, what can the school do? One of the things that I think the criminal justice system can make as a very positive contribution to schools is the whole notion of restorative justice. There's been a number of schools that have moved away from the expel, suspend, get rid of the problem, because as if somehow we can send kids to Mars or some other planet and no one will ever have to deal with them. The fact is, as a local community, these kids aren't going anywhere and we can't just shove them somewhere. But, you know, restorative justice principles where we really look at how can, even if there has been something done that caused harm, how can we enable this child to make it better, to take into account the issues that may have contributed to it, and come up with a positive plan to work.
And that positive plan is a perfect place to end, and we'll be talking more when we do a show on school issues too. Thank you to all of my panelists, and we thank you for joining us this evening for Illinois Law, talking about mental health issues in the juvenile court system.